Okay. We'll just record to the cloud, and then I'll pull it down from there, and hopefully that will work well. Okay. Again, this is week 5, so we are almost done. We've got one more week, obviously, after tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the what I like to call modern organization theories. They're really kind of more modern because some are a few decades old, so they're not exactly yesterday's from yesterday or anything like that, but they're more modern than a lot of the theories that we've talked about up to this point in time, and kind of just wrap up our discussion of the chronological development of organization theory. Thank you for your posts for this past week. I've had a chance to go through all those, read those, and provide some feedback on those as well as a grade. You have one final beach board essay that is due, and that final beach board essay is on systems theory. So you'll be taking your organization you're using for your organizational analysis paper, and then you'll be assessing the system in which your organization operates. Chances are it'll probably be an open system, but whether it's a closed or an open system, and then provide me some examples to illustrate what type of a system your organization is operating in. So that'll be your final beach board essay, and then once you're done with that one, you've got all the beach board essays all wrapped up then for the class. Then what we'll do is next week when we get together, we will do all presentations next Monday, so there'll be no new material, it'll be only presentations. And tonight we do have two folks who were brave enough to volunteer, Lizette and Sam. And so what we'll do is we'll cover our modern organization theories in the first half of class. Then we'll take a break, and then after our break, we'll come back and do those two presentations and get those wrapped up. Then next Monday, we'll reserve the entire time for more presentations. We'll see how far we get in those presentations. If we get through them all, then we won't have to have class on the 21st. If we have some remaining, then we'll finish up those presentations then on Saturday, May 21st. Then also on Saturday, May 21st, you have your organizational analysis paper that is due, as well as the final assessment. But again, the final assessment shouldn't be too burdensome. It just is literally you answering 3 questions about Cal State Long Beach. Give me some examples of classical theorists, some examples of neoclassical theorists like HR and HRM, and then the discussion of what type of system Cal State Long Beach operates within. So that'll again constitute that final assessment that is due on May 21st. Then once we're done with our session on May 21st, you've turned in your final assignments. I'll take the weekend to grade those, and then hopefully by the 23rd, I'll have all of your grades ready to go, and I can input those grades, and you can then move onward and upward. I guess next up would be 697 with Dr. Butts, and then you'll have section 1 with Dr. Butts, and then after that's done, you move into section 2 with me. So that's how things are looking over the next several weeks. So let's go ahead without further ado and get into our discussion of some of these more modern organization theories. Again, to draw some contrast between these more modern theories and some of the classical and neoclassical theories that we've talked about up to this point in time. So where I usually start this discussion is I usually start it with Kurt Lewin and his discussion of group dynamics, which really kind of paves the way then for a school of thought known as participative management. And then we'll talk about some other authors in the School of Participative Management, talk about what the major principles are in participative management, then also talk about how participative management relates to our models of organizational effectiveness, our mechanisms for control, and our methods for motivating employees. So to start with Kurt Lewin and his idea of group dynamics. One of the theories that comes out of Kurt Lewin that I like a lot is this theory known as field theory. And as you know, and as we've discussed throughout this class, public organization theory borrows a lot from other disciplines and other fields. We borrow from the world of the private sector. We borrow from psychology. We borrow from sociology. We borrow from all these other fields. We even borrow from the field of physics. And so this idea of field theory is kind of something we've borrowed from physics, and especially from quantum physics. The idea of field theory is that, and the way it applies here with Lewin, is that individuals and organizations operate within this dynamic field of forces. And so we're surrounded by this field of forces. Kind of like in our everyday lives, we're surrounded by an invisible field of gases. Well, you're surrounded by this invisible field of forces. And these forces will then apply pressure on you to push you in different directions and to kind of modify and mold your behavior. And so these different forces in our field will push us in these different directions. And one of the major forces that kind of pushes us is the force of unaccomplished tasks. So when we have a task that has not yet been accomplished, that will place pressure upon us to accomplish that task. It will create what's called tension. And the only way to release that tension, according to Lewin and field theory, is to actually accomplish the task. And that's how you satisfy that motivation of getting the task accomplished, by actually accomplishing it. Now, where that relates into a lot of our discussion of organization theory takes us back to the whole idea of goals. We've talked about one of the main differences between classical theorists and some more modern theorists is that with classical theorists, they really focus on the macro, the organizational goal, the achievement of the organizational goal. When we look at the more modern theorists, we start to talk about individual goals as well and employee goals. And our goal is to try and find goal congruence between the organization's goals and the individual's goals. Well, whenever we establish those goals, we have to be careful when we engage in goal setting, because when we establish goals for our organization, it is very tempting for us to establish very easy to accomplish goals. Because if they're easy to accomplish, we're going to be able to accomplish them very quickly, and we'll have something to show for our efforts. Again, here at Long Beach, we're going through accreditation. And one of the things in accreditation is we have to go through strategic planning, we have to establish our goals, then we have to close the loop, meaning we have to show how we have achieved those goals or what demonstrable progress we've made toward the achievement of our goals. So when we put those goals together and we do the strategic plan, it's very attractive for us to put together some very simple, very easy to accomplish goals so that we can show that, yes, we have achieved these goals. But what we do know is that sometimes those longer term, those more difficult to achieve goals are actually the ones that are more motivating for employees because it gives them something to work toward. That as those goals remain unaccomplished, those unaccomplished tasks then under field theory place motivation, really place this force on people to try and accomplish those unaccomplished goals. So sometimes more difficult, harder to achieve goals actually are stronger and better motivators than the simple, short-term, easy to accomplish ones. So I think the importance of Lewin and this idea of field theory is that we're not isolated within our organizations, that employees within organizations operate within this environment, this ecology, as John Gauss would call it. And we have to understand how that environment places pressures upon individuals to then shape and mold their behavior, which means that it's a complex type of process for us to try and study individuals within organizations and to understand individual behaviors and motivations, because you have all these different forces that are being placed upon individuals to mold and shape the way in which they act and they behave. Lewin kind of laid the basis for a very famous study that's come to be known as the Iowa Leadership Studies, coming out of the University of Iowa. And Lewin, along with Lippitt and White, are best known for these University of Iowa leadership studies. In these leadership studies, the force within that field that they were looking at is they were looking at leadership. And they're looking at different types of leaders and different types of leadership styles have an impact upon the behavior of individuals within organizations. And are there, if not ideal, are there some types of leadership styles that are more advantageous than others in order to make our organizations more effective and efficient? So what the authors of the Iowa Leadership Studies tried to do is they tried to set up an experiment with different types of groups. So they established what they called the autocratic group, and they established what they called the democratic group. In the autocratic group, they instructed the leader of that group to be very forceful, to be controlling, to be very much in terms of a top-down management style. So that autocratic leader would tell the members of the group, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, this is when it needs to be done. So a very classical top-down autocratic approach. Then another group or other groups were designed to be democratic groups, where they were led by democratic leaders. Democratic leaders would seek out the consultation of members of the group, allow members of the group to participate through self-determination in determining what's going to be done and how it needs to be done and the establishment of goals. Very much a Mary Parker Fall approach to running a group or an organization. One of the interesting things that happened is one of those democratic group leaders went awry and actually became so hands-off that that leader didn't lead whatsoever. It's kind of left the group to its own devices, didn't give any structure, any framework, any guidance, just kind of took their hands off and said, go at it, do what you want to do. That wasn't the way democratic leadership was supposed to work. And that group, the authors are then referred to as the laissez-faire group. You know, hands off, don't touch, let people act the way in which they want to act. So unintentionally, they ended up with three different groups: autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire. But one of the things they found very quickly is that the laissez-faire leadership approach just simply did not work. The laissez-faire group did not get anything done on time. There was no accountability. It was a mess. It was anarchy. So that led them to believe laissez-faire, hands-off leadership, that doesn't work. Then they looked at the autocratic groups. And with the autocratic groups, they saw that one of the problems in the autocratic groups is that you had rebellion on the part of the group members. Group members felt that these autocratic leaders were taking away their stature, and they were keeping them from being able to achieve their goals. That the leader, the autocratic leader, and all that autocratic leader's rules and regulations were barriers in the way of their path to goal attainment. And so some members of these autocratic groups actually became violent and actually rebelled and revolted against autocratic leaders. So obviously that was not a good finding. The democratic groups, however, tend to work the best when that leader left the room. So what they would do is in each of these groups, they would have the leader leave the room, and then they would monitor the group to see how the group worked and interacted. With the autocratic groups, when the autocratic leader left, the group members plotted against the leader. So when the leader came back, they would have a strategy to contend against the leader. In the democratic groups, the students, the groups all worked together and worked collaboratively together, even when the democratic leader was not in the room. And so this then gave them their empirical basis for their finding that democratic leadership, a democratic approach, was the most appropriate approach to use in managing our organizations. And it really laid the path for the development of this school known as participative management. Rensis Leiker, who I'm sure you've heard of Leiker before. Leiker is very famous for a lot of different innovations. One of the things he's most known for is his response scales, those Leiker ordinal response scales. That's Rensis Leiker. And Rensis Leiker took this and distilled this information that they had learned in the Iowa studies into the School of Participative Management. The School of Participative Management postulates that there are 4 different types of management systems. The first type of system is what he called the exploitative authoritative system. So this is kind of your autocratic, authoritative, very much top-down type of management. But that top-down management is being done to exploit the employees. Again, this is kind of, you're going to try and get the contributions you need from these employees, not for their benefit, but rather for the benefit of the organization or the group. Second type of management system is what we refer to as the benevolent authoritative system. Again, it's authoritative, it's top-down in nature, it's very centralized, but it's a much more benevolent, much kinder and friendlier reason why you're being authoritative, in that you're still making the decisions top-down, but you do have some compassion and you do have some consideration for members lower in that organizational structure, but it still is very authoritative. A third management system is the consultative management system. With consultative management, you talk to your employees, you consult with them, You ask them their opinions on things, but you don't necessarily take their opinions into account when you make the final decisions. So this is more kind of a, a subterfuge, if you will, to still be authoritative in nature, but you're at least talking to them and asking them questions. It's kind of what you call a little bit of window dressing to kind of make it look a little bit more like they are involved. The most appropriate approach, though, according to participative management theorists, is the participatory approach. Not surprising, it's right in the name. But in a participatory type of management system, you not only consult with employees, you allow them to actively participate and contribute to the making of decisions. So it's kind of like, when you get to intergovernmental relations, we're going to talk about the difference between decentralization and devolution of power. Decentralization of power is basically allowing someone a seat at the table. Devolution is giving them the resources to actually make substantive decisions and actually have the ability to carry out those decisions. And that's kind of the same difference between a consultative approach and a participatory approach. So, in the world of intergovernmental relations, we talk about, it's one thing to allow state and local governments to, have a seat at the table whenever we're discussing, federal policies, or allow them to attend hearings in Congress. It's another thing altogether to allow them to make decisions on the ground in terms of exactly how policies and programs are going to be implemented. That's that difference. So participative management theorists will argue that it's the participatory approach that is the approach that we need to use in managing our organizations. So how do we use a participatory type of an approach? Well, there are some principles that they developed. Two of the most important principles developed in the participative management school. Number one, we need to establish supportive workplace relationships. We need to establish relationships between all members of our organization where people feel valued, they feel trusted, they feel that they're not going to have reprisals against them or any punitive measures against them for ideas they come up with or creative, innovative solutions to problems. You've got this trust and rapport that is built into the relationships between all members of your organization. And secondly, group decision making. We need to not only allow, but we need to foster group decision making so that people can work together and collaborate. Because once you put people together into a group, the idea is that the collective knowledge and the collective expertise will be greater than the knowledge or expertise of any one member. So this is a big difference from what we saw in the classical school. In the classical school, we really didn't give a lot of credence to the idea of groups. We didn't really see the recognition of group decision-making until we got into neoclassical theorists like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger and others. Now, here again in participative management, we're saying we need to allow people to work in groups and to foster group decision-making, because that's how you get that collective buy-in on what the organization's doing and why it is doing it. So a lot of participative management is really predicated back in the world of Mary Parker Follett. And so many years earlier, Mary Parker Follett was talking about democratic organizations and the participation that we need to foster to get over those two major flaws in a democracy. Those theories really kind of were the antecedents for this whole school known as participative management. In participative management, the models of organizational effectiveness that we will favor, 3 of the 4. And so I think you can certainly make an argument there's the rational goal approach with participative management. Certainly we're focusing inside the organization, so there's certainly an internal process model that's also emphasized with participative management. And clearly, since we are being considerate leaders because we are not only consulting, but having our employees participate with us in the decision making, there's a very strong element of the human relations model as well. In terms of our mechanisms for control, clearly mutual adaptation or mutual adjustment. We are clearly working with our employees, allowing our employees to work amongst themselves in order to make decisions and get the job done. In terms of our methods for motivation, a lot of considerate leadership, obviously group acceptance, and once you allow people to self-determine what they are doing on a daily basis, you're going to foster a lot of that job identification as well. So in participative management, we're really predicating our approach to organizations very much on the idea of building these supportive relationships so that people can cooperate with each other in order to help self-govern and self-determine throughout the entire organization. So it's not just that exploitive or benevolent authoritative approach. It's very much a truly participatory approach to managing humans within our organizations. So a lot of that comes out of Mary Parker Follett. A lot of that kind of comes out of civics literature and the idea of a democracy and how to run an organization with democratic principles. The next school of thought, though, comes primarily out of the private sector and now the world of business. And that's the QM school, quality management. Now, we know quality management really took off, especially in the 1970s and the 1980s in the private sector, and then migrated its way into the public sector as well. One of the primary pioneers, if you will, of the QM movement was obviously Deming. And I'm sure you've heard about Deming before. If you've taken some business courses, you may have read some of Deming's work. Deming was a big proponent of this idea of building quality into the production process. And it's a very intuitive type of rationale, that if we can build quality into the production of how we're producing an output, then that quality production process will lead directly to a quality output. Where quality management QM started is it started in the world of statistical process control. Statistical process control said if we want to monitor the quality of the products that we are creating, we don't have to measure every single product that comes off that assembly line in a factory. We can take a statistically representative sample of the products that we are creating and then have a checklist, kind of a punch list, if you will, where we can check off all the different quality elements for those products that have been selected to be part of our statistical sample. And you're very familiar with sampling, you know how that works, you've had the research methods course, and so you know that if you put together a random sample, that random sample should be somewhat representative of the population as a whole. And so if we're creating 500,000 widgets per year, if we can take a random sample of maybe 5,000 of those and assess those for quality, then those results should then be representative of the sample of the population of 5 million products that we are making. Again, that's only if we are doing a random type of sample. So we do that, we do this statistical process control for the purpose of trying to make it a little bit less onerous on the resources of the organization. But again, the basic principle is if you build quality into the production process, you will then end up with a quality output, with a quality product. Deming really worked very hard to sell that to American corporations. In the beginning, American corporations were not buying. And so Deming, frustrated with American corporations, took his quality management approach overseas. And he took it to Japan and developed his system of statistical process control and quality management in Japan. That process that he developed for Japanese corporations was successful in Japan, so successful that American corporations then took note of it, and then American corporations started to adopt this Japanese form of statistical process control. And finally, American companies started to discover the quality management process here in the US. The primary way that quality management has really grown up here in the US is with the process known as TQM, Total Quality Management. If you've worked in the private sector, you've probably run into TQM before. If even if you work in the public sector, some public organizations use TQM as well. For the total quality management, we again are trying to build quality into the process, and then that process will result in a quality output. TQM is predicated on the following points. Number one, a focus on the customer. You need to look at the customer, you need to look at the customer's needs, and then you design the product to meet those specific customers' needs. Very similar to what we did in the reinvention of government in the Clinton-Gore administration. When we did the reinvention of government in the 1990s, that was all predicated on a consumer focus. Ask what will benefit your consumers and then tailor the product to benefit those consumers. Sounds kind of familiar to something we talked about last week when we talked about Robert Burton, and we talked about his approach, his middle range theories, and his approach of focusing on the consequences as opposed to focusing on the rules and regulations. So you focus on the consequences for your consumers. You involve all employees in the quality process. So everyone who has any hand whatsoever in the production of this output is going to be involved in total quality management. We create things like quality circles. In those quality circles, you'll have the people who are responsible for creating this part of the output are going to work together in a quality circle, exchange ideas, and hopefully by creating this quality circle, then each one of those quality circles will create their contribution to the output. And if their contributions are quality contributions, then the overall quality of the output will obviously be enhanced. In TQM, we're really focusing on the process of how we are doing it so that we can create an output that will meet the needs of our consumers. Integration, you integrate the functions. And so in these quality circles, you integrate all the different things each member of the quality circle is doing, identifying how what you're doing contributes to the quality of the output, what I'm doing contributes to the quality of output, and so on and so on. You are very strategic and systemic in the way in which you make decisions about how to produce this output. You identify throughout TQM things you're doing well, as well as things you are not doing well. For those things you are not doing well, you then have the feedback loop. So you can feed that information back into the production process through this process of continuous improvement. So you're always learning, you're always modifying your production process. Decisions are based upon fact. And so through this continuous improvement, through this feedback loop, we're going to take empirical evidence that we have generated and feed that back to make more new decisions about how we should change the production process. And in order to do all of this, in order to be able to integrate and to be strategic and to involve employees and to use empirical fact-based decision-making, we need to have a good system of communication. And those quality circles will give you that good system of communication. Because if those folks are working together in a quality circle, all working toward the same outcome, then clearly there's going to be some trust and some rapport that's developed within that communication process. So TQM actually was sold to a lot of organizations as kind of a magic bullet. It was very much sold as kind of being a panacea that could create a quality output. But we do recognize that there are some serious limitations to how we can apply quality management in public organizations. Giron added to what Deming did in quality management and told us that quality really needs to run through the entire planning process, that you need to build quality into your planning process. You need to build quality into your control process in terms of how you make sure that your outputs are quality types of outputs. And then quality also needs to be built into the improvement process. We always have to recognize there's room for improvement, and our entire production process is going to be a continuous improvement type of process. But like we said, whether you read Deming or Giron or any of the QM theorists, it probably will strike you that some of their theories and thoughts don't apply as well to public organizations as they may apply to private sector organizations. And there are some major obstacles to applying QM to the public sector. One major obstacle is structural fragmentation. As we know, in the public sector, we're much more fragmented than we are in the private sector. We have a lot more actors involved in the public sector than the private sector. We have a lot more fragmentation of power and resources in the public sector as compared to the private sector. It's much easier in a private organization for the leader of a private organization to say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. If you're going to implement QM into a public organization, it's more difficult because public managers don't have the same amount of power and authority oftentimes over their employees because of civil service, because of collective bargaining agreements, because of legislative requirements. So there's a lot of structural fragmentation. You oftentimes also in the public sector, you don't have just one organization responsible for a program or a policy. Oftentimes, one program is going to flow through many different agencies and organizations. So you may have a federal agency that's involved. You may have state agency. You may have a local agency. You may have some nonprofit partners that are involved. You might have JPAs who are involved. And so there's a lot of fragmentation. Secondly, we know about the lack of incentives in the public sector. You don't have the same ability to incentivize production and quality in production as you might be able to incentivize in the private sector. We also know in the public sector, we have very high levels of turnover among our leadership. We know that especially when we have political appointees leading organizations, their average lifespan in that organization could be anywhere from 18 to 24 to 36 months. The chances are not going to be there for a very, very long time. When you have high turnover in leadership, obviously it makes it difficult for you to implement and stick with a certain type of principle or a certain type of theory or approach. Statutory barriers. The programs that we are implementing obviously come out of enabling legislation. That enabling legislation will impose certain statutory requirements on us in terms of how we are supposed to implement that program, what populations we are supposed to be serving, how we're supposed to be serving those populations. Those statutory barriers from the enabling legislation we deal with in the public sector, we're not really that concerned about that in the private sector. Sure, there are government regulations that private corporations need to deal with. There's no doubt about that, especially if you are contracting with the federal government. But the statutory barriers are much less onerous in the private sector as compared to the public sector. Resistance to giving up power. Quality management means that you need to give some power resources to employees. You need to empower these quality circles and these work groups, because if they're not empowered, they're not going to have a substantive impact. But as we've talked about before, in the public sector, sometimes public managers don't have the same repository of power that private sector managers have, so they cling to the power that they do have. They don't want to share the power. They don't want to share the resources or share the information. So it's more difficult to delegate in the public sector sometimes compared to the private sector. A lack of resources. Obviously, we don't have the same set of resources in a lot of our public organizations that we have in our private sector organizations. Quality management will take resources. If you identify that there is some flaw in the process, you're going to need to remedy that through your continuous improvement. Well, that's probably going to take money. And sometimes you don't have the appropriations or the allocations that are necessary to make those quality improvements. Conflicting goals, obviously, we've talked about this many times. In public organizations, we have conflicting goals that oftentimes are not just numerous, but they often do run into conflict with each other, more so than the private sector. And then a lack of performance measurement. In the public sector, we don't have a lot of pay for performance. We're in our position classification systems, working within our position descriptions. So it makes it more difficult for us to reward performance. It also makes it more difficult for us to measure performance. because a lot of the outputs that we are creating, a lot of those products are very qualitative in nature. They're very subjective in nature. They don't have the empirical indicators of success that you would have with a widget in the private sector. So that lack of performance measurement makes it very difficult for us to use quality management. Despite all those obstacles, though, we talk about the School of Quality Management because TQM did work its way into the public sector. We saw it in the 80s and the 90s and into this century as well. So it is an approach that you may see in a public organization, but it oftentimes needs to be a modified approach because you just can't take quality management as it works in the private sector and apply it directly to the public sector. And that's kind of one of those themes throughout the entire evolution of the organization theory literature, is that yes, we can borrow from the private sector, but we have to tweak it a little bit. We have to modify it. We have to change it to make it fit the political environment in which we are operating in our public organizations. Now, in terms of total quality management, or just the quality management school itself, with models of organizational effectiveness, obviously it's going to have the potential to touch on all four of those different models. Depending upon how you do it, there's certainly a rational goal approach. Certainly there's an open systems approach. Human relations becomes very important with performance measurement, performance rewards, and very much internal process, because the whole point of it is to build quality into the process to then end up with a quality output. There's a lot of mutual adjustment that's going on in your mechanisms for coordination and control, and obviously a lot of standardization. That if you can standardize work processes, those standardized work processes hopefully will then help you standardize work values, help you standardize work outputs, as well as helping you standardize worker skills. Where I take issue with Tompkins is I would shade in standardization of work processes, because I think it's really kind of standardization across the board when you're looking at quality management. In terms of methods for motivating our employees, there's considerate leadership. Certainly there are some group acceptance, there's job identification, and hopefully some goal congruence in that we are all sharing the same goals, both individual goals, organizational goals, and we can find the nexus that connects organizational and individual goals. But again, TQM is not nearly in as much favor today as it used to be a few decades ago, because of all those obstacles to application in the public sector that we have discussed. One of the more modern theories that I am a big fan of is the School of Organizational Culture. And we've talked about organizational culture in this class before, but tonight I really want to expand upon it, because I think it is one of those schools of thought that really holds a lot of potential for how we study our organizations. Now, in organization culture school of thought, we make the argument that every organization has its own unique culture. Just like every society has its own culture, every organization has its own culture as well. And when you think about a society's culture, you think about things like what we value as a society, and what we expect, the types of behaviors we expect of each other, the norms, the values, those all make up our societal culture. And just like you have a societal culture, you have an organizational culture as well. And Sheen is one of the big advocates of organization culture, if you want to have an author to hang on the school of thought. And Sheen argues that, again, every organization has its own unique culture, and to understand why organizations behave in the ways in which they do, you need to understand that organization's unique culture. There are 3 levels of organization culture according to Sheen. The first level is what he calls the artifacts. These are your very visible organizational structures. And so things like meetings from minutes, agendas from minutes, policies and procedures, handbooks, those are all artifacts. They're written, they're very easy to access, they're very easy to see. So it'd be kind of similar to when you go on an archaeological dig and you dig up an eating utensil. That's an artifact. You can touch it, it's tangible. You can then look at that and then make assumptions about how that ancient society functioned. Well, same type of thing with the organizational artifact. You can read the minutes, the agendas, the policy and procedure manuals, and you can then make assumptions about the daily life of that organization. But that's at the very superficial level. It's very, very tangible, very easy to access, very easy to analyze. Then hidden below that, at a more hidden level, is the second level of culture, which he calls the espoused values. Espoused values are things such as your mission statement, your vision statement, your strategic plan, and the goals and the objectives incorporated within your strategic plan. This is where the organization goes out and specifically says, here are the things that we value as an organization. Now, these are our sets of values as an organization. So they're espoused, they're told to you. So again, those are relatively easy to get. They may not be quite as tangible, perhaps, as an agenda or meeting minutes, but they're still pretty easy to access. They're at a level a little more hidden and a little bit below the artifacts level. Then the third level of organization culture is the most difficult level to access, and that's what he calls the basic assumptions. So every organization culture will have its basic assumptions. There are certain basic assumptions that we all share as members of the organization about how we should behave, how we should interact with each other, how the organization should behave, and what the organization should do. Those basic assumptions are usually not really talked about. We don't really discuss them. We just expect that everyone knows them and that everyone will adhere to them. One example of that is something like civility. And it's been interesting over the past few years, we have seen organizations start to adopt civility codes. At Long Beach, we adopted a civility code, primarily based upon some actions of a few faculty members that kind of precipitated the need for a civility code. When I was on the school board in my school district, we adopted a civility code as well. Before that point in time, though, that was all just kind of assumed. It was assumed that you would treat people with respect. It was assumed that you would not, use off-color language, with parents or with teachers or in school premises. Those were all things that were assumed. Those are basic assumptions. Unfortunately, now we have to write them down. And so they become a little bit more tangible. But in the past, that would be a basic assumption. We all share that. That's what we expect, how we expect ourselves to behave and how we expect others in the organization to behave as well. Clearly, when it's a basic assumption that is not written down and it's something we just all share, it's going to be something that's more difficult for us to study. So that's the third and the most hidden level of organization culture. So Sheen makes an interesting argument that I think is true, is that leaders have the opportunity and the ability to embed culture into their organizations. So cultures can develop in different ways. One way you can get a culture is because a leader comes into the organization and will consciously embed that culture into the organization. In some organizations, the culture is just something that has developed over the years. Organizations have been around for 60, 70 years, and these are the practices we've engaged in, and it's just created this culture over the years. So it can sometimes gradually develop. But good leaders are able to embed cultures into their organization. And I don't know if you have your book with you, but if you don't, you can look at it later. But if you do have your book with you, on page 367, we have Sheen telling us here are some what he calls primary embedding mechanisms, and here are some secondary articulation and reinforcement mechanisms for culture. So some of the primary embedding mechanism he tells us. One is what leaders pay attention to. So leaders measure and what they control on a regular basis. So if it's something that the leader is paying attention to, that clues employees into, well, this is something that's obviously important. And if it's important, it's an important element of the culture of that organization. How leaders respond to critical incidents and organizational crises can also embed culture into the organization. So if a leader is able to have a very reasoned, a very rational response to a crisis, that's going to clue in everyone else in the organization to this is the way we should behave in a crisis. If, however, it's a 5-alarm fire, that's going to embed a different type of culture into that organization. The observable criteria by which leaders allocate scarce resources. Organizations have limited resources. And so how are those limited resources allocated? The basis on which those scarce resources are allocated can also then clue employees into what is considered important by organizational leadership and what is part of that organization's culture. Role modeling and coaching. There is a theory, a motivational theory known as social learning theory. This is basically social learning theory, where people can learn by role modeling leaders in the organization. Observe criteria by which leaders allocate rewards and status. So what you get, these prize perks of the job for also signals culture. And the observed criteria by which leaders recruit, select, promote, retire, and excommunicate organizational members. So how you do your HR and the criteria you use for hiring people and promoting people and retaining people will also directly embed culture into the organization. But in addition to those primary ways, there are also secondary reinforcement mechanisms that can be used as well. Some of those are the design and structure of the organization. So what's the organizational chart look like? Is it a tall hierarchy? Is it a flat hierarchy? Do you have groups that are incorporated within the organizational chart? All that can reinforce the culture of the organization. Procedures and processes used in the organization can also then reinforce that culture. The design of physical space, that also can have an impact upon culture. And this is a really interesting one for me, is that you can design your physical space to communicate culture. So if you want to have a very open culture where people should be free to communicate, stop by other people's desks and talk, and you're not going to have cubicles. You're going to have a very open workspace. One of the things in my district we did is the finance department was located on the second floor of the district offices. No one outside the finance department really interacted with anyone from the finance department. And the finance department was always viewed as kind of this black hole. That, the paperwork that needed to go to the finance department went there, and the finance department did whatever they did with it, and then people got paid. But you didn't really know a whole lot about what was going on in the finance department. People really didn't interact a lot with the people in the finance department. So when it came to remodeling the district office, they remodeled the district office to tear down walls, to make it a much more open space, and to then co-locate some other departments, people from other departments in that area, so that people, it wasn't such a mystery what was going on in the finance department. And that was all done using physical space to try and encourage more communication and integration. In the world of urban affairs and urban housing, there's a very famous housing project was known as Pruitt-Igoe. And Pruitt-Igoe was this housing project that was created in the 1960s that was not very user-friendly. It was the type of housing project where you had an elevator system, but the way in which the elevator system was designed, it only stopped at every other floor. And so if you lived on the 17th floor, you would have to either take the elevator to the 16th floor and walk up, or you'd have to take it to the 18th floor and walk down. But that's not a very friendly type of physical design to the building. And there are a lot of other things that were not very friendly in terms of a place to live in Pruitt-Igoe. And people really didn't have a whole lot of buy-in to that, is really seeing it as home. It was basically a place where they slept, as a place where they had to reside, but really wasn't their home, and kind of fell into disrepair and was an example of how physical space can have a negative impact upon the development of culture. Stories, legends, myths, every organization has its own, urban legends and myths. Those can also help reinforce culture. And formal statements of organizational philosophy and creed, again, sometimes using slogans and things like that, can also help reinforce the culture of the organization. So the upshot of all this is that if we believe that organizations have their own unique cultures, it tells us a different way to study those organizations. It again takes us far afield from the classic organization theorists. And we can no longer say, well, here's the ideal structure for all organizations. We can no longer say, here's the ideal work process for all work being done in the organization. Those days are over with. Now we need to look at each organization differently, and we have to assess the unique culture in each one of our organizations in order to understand those organizations. It's a much more contextual way in which we study organizations today. But I think it's a very appropriate approach. And again, it's going to highlight all of your models of organizational effectiveness because it depends. It depends upon the culture of the organization. Some organizations are much more focused on their internal processes. Some are more focused on the relationships with their employees. Some more focused on achieving their goals and being production and performance oriented. Some are much more interested in how they interact with their environments and obtain those surplus resources. It's really going to depend upon that unique culture in that organization. Hopefully, because we have a culture in the organization and people understand and know the culture, you will have a standardization of values among members of your organization. And that standardization of values will then lead you to a congruence of organizational and individual goals. But again, I do like organization culture theory a lot because I do think our organizations have unique cultures. Obviously, there are some overlaps, certainly, and we've seen that in a lot of your beach board postings so far, that you're talking about a different organization than your colleague, but you're finding some similarities. So there are always going to be similarities, but there are also going to be some important differences as well. And that's why we have to look at our organizations as their own unique cultures. And then the final school of thought that we talk about here in our modern theories discussion is the focus on leadership. But this is kind of where a lot of the organization theory literature has gone. It's moved toward a contextual focus on organizations, but it's also moved toward a focus on the impact of leadership on organizational behaviors and processes. So I think it's important that we recognize that renewed focus on leadership here in the modern day of our organization theories. We've already talked a little bit about leadership tonight. We talked about Lewin and leadership. We talked about the autocratic and democratic and laissez-faire leadership and how Lewin and his partners identified democratic leadership as the most appropriate leadership approach, and to do it through this participative type of management, this participative type of leadership. Historically, though, the leadership literature tended to focus more on what was called the trait-based approach, where leadership scholars would talk about these traits that people were born with, that there are certain traits that make someone a good, strong leader. And those are oftentimes traits that people are kind of born with, people who have confidence, people who are more gregarious in nature. Those are the traits that kind of make for good, effective leaders. The problem with the trait-based approach, though, is if you assume that there are some people who are preordained or predestined to be leaders, it means it's going to be difficult to teach other folks how to be leaders. So you just got this small cadre of people who are born leaders, and no one else can then break into the leadership ranks. And that's troubling, especially in a program like ours, in an MPA program or an MBA program or an organizational behavior and leadership program. So as long as you hold on to the trait-based approach, it's going to be hard for you to teach people how to be leaders. Fortunately, though, the literature moved off of the trait-based approach and moved more into what's called a behavioralist approach. And the behavioralist approach was really pioneered primarily by what are called the Ohio State studies. And in the 1950s, we had the Ohio State University did its Ohio State Leadership Studies. And in the Ohio State Leadership Studies, they focused primarily on two components of leadership, and they categorized leaders based upon two components. One component of leadership they refer to as focus on structure. And by focus on structure, they talked about how interested leaders were in getting the job done, achieving organizational goals. That's what they called a focus on structure. Some leaders are very much focused on structure. They're very much focused on the organization and accomplishing those organizational goals. Very focused on performance and productivity. Other leaders, however, are more focused on their employees. Those are what the Ohio State authors refer to as consideration-based leaders. Consideration-based leaders have consideration for the well-being, the wants, needs, and desires of their employees. So it kind of set up this binary situation where leaders were either very production-oriented, they were very structure-oriented, or they're very employee-oriented, very consideration type of orientation. A few years after the Ohio State studies, the University of Michigan then produced its own set of studies that very closely mirrored and modeled on the Ohio State studies. They just changed the wording a little bit. And so whereas Ohio State said structure versus consideration, Michigan talked about employee-oriented versus production-oriented. So how oriented are they toward the well-being of their employees versus how oriented are they toward production, achieving the goals of the organization, and getting the job done. That behavioral approach kind of dominated for quite a period of time. And still today, we use this behavioral approach in talking about contingency-based leadership. It really is this binary comparison where we can categorize leaders based upon their concern for employees versus organizational production. More recently, we have identified three main leadership styles, and this is kind of where the leadership literature kind of settled a few years ago. One leadership style that comes out of the literature is obviously charismatic leadership, and we've talked about that in this class before. You're familiar with charismatic leadership. We talked about that back when we talked about Max Weber. In charismatic leadership, you lead by your personality, and so people follow you because they either identify with you or they value some of the things that you do and some of the things that you stand for. But in charismatic leadership, the power resides within the person as opposed to residing within the office. A lot of leaders are charismatic leaders. I'm sure if you look back on your career and leaders you have worked with, you probably won't have any trouble identifying charismatic leaders. You know, some of the most notorious leaders in world history fall under the category of charismatic leaders. The good thing about charismatic leadership is it engenders very strong support among followers. And so followers are very dedicated to these charismatic leaders. But again, the problem is that the leadership power tends to be transitive and very transient in that it's in the person and not in the office. So when that person leaves the organization, they oftentimes will take that power base with them instead of it staying in the office within the organization. We've also talked about transactional leadership before. We talked about that a lot with Chester Barnard. We talked about his incentives and contributions and trying to balance incentives and contributions. That's a transactional form of leadership. You get the contributions from your employees by providing them with the incentives that they value. A lot of motivational theories, such as Vroom's expectancy theory, are predicated upon this transactional type of leadership. It means you have to know your employees, you have to know what they value, and then provide them with that right set of incentives. Every incentive that you provide has what's called a valence to it. So every employee will place a valence on each one of those incentives. The valence is how much they value that incentive. So if one person may value additional time off, another person may value being employee of the week. You need to know what your employees value and engage in these types of transactions. Again, it's what we refer to with mayors as a broker type of mayor. So you make these political decisions and broker the power. Another type of leadership that you're also familiar with, I'm sure, is transformational leadership, which tends to be a little bit more visionary in nature. Transformational leaders don't engage necessarily in this transaction type of relationship all the time. Instead, what they do is they bring a vision into the organization. Like Sheen would say, they embed their culture into the organization. So they come into the organization with a bigger picture, a bigger vision. They embed that vision into that organization, and they lead through that vision. They lead through their ability to transform the organization and transform the culture of that organization. We obviously would hope that most of our leaders, most of the time, are transformational, but we know that being a transformational leader requires a lot of resources. Sometimes new leaders will burn up a lot of their political capital, their goodwill that they bring with them when they come to the organization, trying to be true transformational. Where the literature sits today is that it's a balance between the two, that there's a balance between being transactional and being transformational. It's what's called contingency-based leadership. You lead by situation, as Mary Parker Fallah tells us. So hopefully most of the time you can be transformational, but sometimes you may need to be transactional with certain employees in certain types of situations. If you're in a crisis situation and you're dealing with an employee who's difficult to deal with, you may not be able to be transformational in that moment. You might not have the time or the resources. So instead, you may need to be transactional. So a good way to look at this is with this contingency table from William Redden. It's William Redden's 4 styles of contingency-based leadership. So what Redden tells us is, going back to the behavioralist approach, is that on the left side, in that first column, your y-axis basically, you see concern for people. So this is the leader's concern for employees. Do they have a high concern for employees? Do they have a low concern for employees? Then in the second and third column, you see concern for performance. This is your concern for getting the job done, low versus high. So in certain periods of time, some leaders tend to be very concerned about their employees, but also very concerned about the organization. If you're concerned about your employees and concerned about the performance of your organization, you're going to fall into the democratic leadership category. You're going to try and combine organizational and individual goals. You're going to try very hard to find that congruence between those organizational and those individual goals. If you have a high concern for performance, but a low concern for people, that makes you the autocratic leader. So you rely upon your authority in a very much of a top-down management with very little employee involvement. And we see what happened in the Iowa studies with autocratic leaders. If otherwise you have a low concern for performance, but a high concern for people, then you fall in the human relations leader category. You focus on organizational harmony, focus on keeping people happy. Some authors pejoratively refer to this as country club leadership. We're just trying to make sure everyone gets along and everyone is happy in their positions. The worst possible situation, obviously, is a low concern for performance and a low concern for people. That would be this laissez-faire leader, and we saw in the Iowa studies what happened with the laissez-faire leader. People become uncontrollable. Leaders just throw their hands up and say, I'm just going to bide my time until retirement. I can't control it. I'm never going to try and control it. And they take their hands completely off the leadership wheel. Hopefully we can find a situation where as leaders we can be democratic, where you can have a high concern for getting the job done and achieving organizational goals, but then have a high concern for the well-being of our employees as well. But what we have learned about leadership, it is very situationally based, and it is very contingent, in that it's contingent upon the situation. Are we facing a crisis? Do we have a strong dyadic relationship with our employees? Meaning that do we have a good, strong rapport with our employees? Typically, if you have a good rapport, a good dyadic relationship with your employee, you're going to be able to be, have much more concern for people and be much more democratic in your leadership style. If you don't have that relationship, those leaders then tend to end up being a little bit more autocratic with those employees. So it really is going to depend upon the employee you're dealing with and the situation in which you find yourself. The literature really is oriented today much more around contingency-based types of leadership styles. But to kind of sum it all up across the past 150 years of organizational theory literature, the one thing that really should jump out at you that we've mentioned many times is that the development of the literature has really been a movement away from the one-size-fits-all approach to a recognition of it depends. It really depends upon the situation in which we find ourselves. How we structure organization depends upon a lot of different, structural contingency theory will tell us depends upon a lot of the contingencies we're dealing with in terms of funding and technology and our labor pool and so on and so on. How we structure and behave as an organization will depend upon our external environment. It will depend upon our organizational culture. It will depend upon the leadership style, the leaders in that organization. There really is no ideal bureaucracy anymore. It's really the search for the most appropriate as opposed to the best solution. And that's really what's characterized this entire transformation of the literature from the late 1800s up until the current point in time. Again, the problem with that's a good thing. The problem with that is it makes it more difficult for us as students of organizations, because we really do need to focus on the unique aspects of our organization and then find the most appropriate strategies for that organization at that given point in time. The old adage is that public administration and public organizations are floating in the seas of time, and that there are some commonalities between them, but they're very dynamic types of organizations. And how you lead an organization today may be different than how you led that organization pre-COVID pandemic. And so it does make it more difficult for us to study our organizations, but I think it's a much more apt and much more appropriate way for us to study those institutions. And that is it. That's all the material. That's all the schools of thought and theories that we cover in this class. Hopefully that's given you a good chronological development of the organization theory literature that you can then take some of these theories and some of these concepts and then apply them in your own organization, and also apply them in your organization theory case study that you'll be doing in your next two classes. There are two sections of 697. So at this point in time, any questions or observations on any of these modern organization theories? Pretty good for now?
I wanted to share one of my experiences regarding the culture of the organization.
Sure, go ahead.
So when I moved from the city of Long Beach to where I work, there was this unwritten rule that I thought that parking was first come, first serve. And I did not know that. So in the beginning few weeks, I had rubbed the people in the wrong way because I had parked in their spots. So I didn't know that they have a dedicated spot, because I come from a culture and that's not written. Their manuals don't say that. So I thought that was something that came up in mind when you were saying about the organization culture.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, it's something as simple as parking, but like you said, it's nothing that's been written, rules or procedures. It's just assumed in the culture. And as a new member of the organization, you don't know that. And yeah, I could certainly see some people saying, well, you can't park there. That's my spot. I've parked there for the past 10, 15 years. It's a great example of kind of one of those informal, unwritten parts of the culture that we kind of learn as we join the organization. It's not really part of any formal onboarding type of training. Is just something we have to learn as we get our feet on the ground. So yeah, I think that's an excellent example. Very good. Thanks, Faisal. Anyone else? Any other observations or? Okay. If not, it's 7:10. So let's go ahead and take a break at this point. So we'll take a break, 15-minute break. We'll come on back at 7:25. And at 7:25, we have Lizette and Sam, and I've enabled screen sharing. So when we come back, we'll do those two presentations, and then we'll call it a night. And then next week, we'll work on finishing up our others. So take a break, come on back at 7:25, and we will start off with our presentations. Okay, we're back from break. It's 7:25. So like I said, we have two brave souls who volunteered to do their presentations tonight. Our first one is Lizette. So Lizette, I've got the screen sharing on for you, so you should be able to share your slides if you like. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Okay, can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Sorry. I keep forgetting how to share so I can have my notes on the other side. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure that one out. I don't use PowerPoint often. Let's see, let us know. View.
Maybe you have to move the mic a little away because your breathing noise can be heard.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. That's a little awkward. Okay, sorry. Slideshow. Setup slideshow? No. Okay,
You should be able to just click share screen. It should.
Yeah, so I was just trying to, I added notes to all of my slides, and I know I've done it where I've had my notes on the side and let me just share.
I think after you share screen, you can double tap the top
Perfect.
and then be able to see your notes.
Thank you, Kamara. Oh, I think you're seeing the view where I have my notes, huh? You are.
We can't see the notes.
Oh, you can't. Okay.
No.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, perfect. All right, thanks everyone for bearing with me. My name is Lizette Flores. Good evening to everyone. My organizational analysis will be on the Orange County Social Services Agency, which is the agency that I am currently employed with. I've actually been employed with OCSSA for close to 8 years now. And we'll go right into the executive summary. So the goal of this organizational analysis paper is to identify the varying organizational theories that are embodied within the Orange County Social Services Agency, more specifically the Staffing and Strategic Planning Department. To achieve this, insight into the Staffing and Strategic Planning Department, structure and management practices will be provided, and parallels to a variety of classical organization, neoclassical organization and system theories will be derived. Lastly, the organizational characteristics which contribute to excellence, as well as the metrics to measure excellence, will be discussed. Okay. And then before I move forward, everyone's able to see my PowerPoint, right? Okay, thank you. Okay, so a little introduction and background to the Orange County Social Services Agency. So OCSSA administers a wide variety of federal, state, and county social service programs for residents in the County of Orange that range from healthcare, food assistance, cash aid, and supportive services for children and adults. The goal of the agency is to protect children and adults from abuse or neglect, enable the frail and disabled to remain in their homes, move eligible families from dependency to self-sufficiency, and provide public assistance benefits for eligible recipients. OCSSA provides one or more types of services and assistance to approximately 2 out of every 5 child residents, 1 out of every 4 adult residents, and 1 out of every 6 senior residents of Orange County. In addition, OCSSA employs over 4,000 employees and operates a close to $1 billion budget, which does make it the largest agency within the County of Orange. So a little, yes.
I'm just to let you know that we can see your notes. I wasn't sure if you're trying.
Okay.
If you want to click on the present at the very bottom right, it should be able to.
Thank you. Okay, but now I'm not able to see my notes.
It's still showing.
It's
on
still
our
showing
end.
them, yeah.
Mhm.
I know I'm able to do it. Sorry, where I'm able to see my notes on one screen. I have 2 screens and then my
Mhm.
PowerPoint on the other, right? But where do I?
Yes. If you want to click on.
presenter view, like use presenter view to
Oh.
your right. There's like a little check mark. More to your right. A little bit more right there. Wait, more to the right. Down. No. Down right there. That little.
Use presenter view.
See if that works.
Okay, no, I don't think that's working for me. Okay, I mean, if you guys don't mind seeing my notes, are you guys okay with that? I apologize.
Or you could,
It's fine. Yeah, we don't mind if
We don't mind.
yeah.
Now you know exactly what I'm going to say before I say it. Oh my gosh. This is so embarrassing. I'm so sorry. I know I've done this before. I don't know why I'm just freezing right now. I don't know why I know I've done it before.
Instead of doing share presentation, you can do share screen. That way we can only see one screen.
Okay. Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. Let me do it again and let me share my other screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, are you guys now seeing my just PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you all again. I apologize. Okay, so now into the organizational structure. The Orange County Social Services Agency is divided into 4 different divisions, which each focus on different sectors of assistance, and there are also several support teams. So due to the size of the agency and the varied divisions and programs within OCSSA, I will focus specifically on the department that I work within, which is the Assistance Program Staffing and Strategic Planning. So the primary goal of the Staffing and Strategic Planning Department is to analyze and interpret various statistical data to identify proper staffing and training needs throughout the Assistance Program Division while ensuring uninterrupted continuity of regional operations. This department is responsible for staffing a division of over 1,900 employees, coordinating to the onboarding and training of new and existing staff, and overseeing new divisional projects and endeavors. So I'm calling it a department, but and I'm going to call it SSP department just for purposes of not saying a mouthful every time I mention the name of the department. It is more like a team of 7 individuals who responds to a deputy director and who collaborates closely with other administrative departments such as Human Resource Services, training and career development, as well as several regional offices. Okay. So moving on to the illustrative management practices of the organization. So I found that overall, as an agency, the Social Services Agency runs more on the internal process model, which stresses information management and communication as a means for coordinating work activities so that tasks are carried out in a disciplined and predictable manner. This is more along the lines of Weber and Taylor's theories, but the SSP department really functions more on a human relations model, which focuses internally on the people who comprise really the team, emphasizes the need for structural flexibility. There really is a need to have that social cohesion within all team members. We really need to work on keeping high morale because we do have a pretty high workload and things are ever changing. And this is more related to Follett and McGregor's Y theory. As far as job identification, as far as employee motivation, we found that job identification is really what would be the main source of employee motivation, which revolves around intrinsic rewards and the desire for growth opportunities and the opportunity to complete challenging and interesting work. So in further slides, I'll go ahead and demonstrate a little bit about how you can join my department. It isn't a department that naturally would hire individuals straight into it. It's usually through a means of an opportunity that opens up. And really it is almost considered like the next level. Once joining the agency, it's one of the next levels to really achieve any career advancement or to really, open the doors to further, really endeavors and really achievements within the agency. Okay, and on to my next one. Okay, so going on to the classical organization theories that I felt are representative of the Staffing and Strategic Planning Team, or SSP department. So Weber's ideal bureaucracy, I found that hierarchy of authority and written rules was something that applied to really the agency as a whole and to the department. As I mentioned, the agency in general is a pretty large agency with over 4,000 employees. Therefore, a hierarchy of authority is vital for operation of this organization. As I mentioned, we are divided into divisions, and then each division is headed by an agency director, and then there are division directors, and then there's deputy directors, and then we have a slew of managers and really subordinate staff. we're also really big on following a chain of command. This is a really important concept within OCSSA, and each employee hired is clearly informed of their specific chain of command. In addition, written rules are a really big thing for us. We know them as policies and procedures, and they are a focal point of our organization as they ensure uniformity and adherence to the guidelines set forth by different ruling entities. We do receive overall instruction from federal, state, and county levels. And having these policies and procedures in place ensures that we are compliant in our evaluation and administration of services to the public. And really, without these written rules, we are at risk of incurring financial sanctions and violating really the rights of employees, as there are employee policies and procedures, as well as the services that we administer to the community. As far as tailored scientific management, I felt that this agency embodied the performance evaluations and financial incentives, really pieces of his theory. The performance of all staff is gauged through a series of performance evaluations that must be completed by direct supervisors. Really, in order to be able to complete a fair and thorough evaluation, there is kind of like an unwritten rule. There really is I don't know if it's necessarily written, but best practice would be to complete monthly conferences with each team member, just to ensure that they are all meeting expectations and that they are working towards achieving the 5 core competencies that are set in place by the agency, which are work habits and quality, job knowledge and skills, productivity and effectiveness, interpersonal skills, and attendance and punctuality. And then as far as financial incentives linked to these performance evaluations is the ability to receive merit increases. We are unionized, and the union does set forth pretty much like a minimum merit increase if expectations are being met, but if expectations are being exceeded, then an additional step in pay can be granted depending on really how well an individual is exceeding really the expectations. And then to review really some of the principles within that principle school of thought, I felt that the coordinative principle and the function principle was present within the agency. The coordinative principle states that organizations require a formal structure consistent with the organization's essential purpose, which we definitely do have. This requires a coordinative effort and grants authority to managers to issue rules and ensure procedures are followed in that coordinated manners. So specifically in my team, we do have a variety of classifications. We're not all of the same classification, and we all do report to a direct supervisor and ultimately to our manager and deputy. And then the functional principle involves dividing the organization's work into discrete activities according to their function and assigning those activities to specific organizational units. So we're actually a pretty good example of that. The work that we do specifically has been limited to our team, and we're tasked with the hiring of staff and coordinating staff movements in response to organizational changes and development of the agency. We don't deal with eligibility programs or administration of benefits to the community, and we also don't deal with program or policy interpretation. Okay, and then now moving on to the neoclassical organizational theories. When discussing Follett's theories, I felt that participative management and collective problem solving was really present within my department. As I had mentioned, we are responsible for addressing staffing and training needs for a pretty large division. So planning for a new project that requires staff to be hired or perhaps carved out of existing staffing resources is something that we have to deal with every day. Therefore, Follett's participative management theory applies as each team member, regardless of classification, is able to partake in planning and meetings that determine the approach to tackling the task at hand. In addition, collective problem solving is another theory that we often see within this department as we collaborate with several regional offices and we ensure that any staffing concerns are addressed as soon as possible. So for example, whenever there is a staffing shortage or a staffing need at any specific office, we complete an analysis to see, pretty much it's called the span of control analysis, and we check to see according to the workload and the resources that exist at each office. When we look at the division as a whole, we see which offices perhaps are in a better place than the office in need. We bring them together collaboratively, we discuss our findings, and really involve them in the decision-making process with the goal of being able to shift some resources with everyone being in agreement. And as far as McGregor's theory, I felt that his theory Y is what we most closely related to. While there is always room for growth and progress, I feel that his theory Y is present because those that join this department have to volunteer and request a transfer or rotation into the department whenever there is an opening. So the first step does prove the volunteers' commitment to the department and their desire for personal growth and their desire to seek new responsibilities. In addition, these transfer and rotation opportunities are afforded to many individuals across the agency and across different classifications. Which provides growth opportunities and exposure to more challenging work to those at the bottom of the organization. And then lastly, once selected to join the department, the feedback and input from each team member is solicited and considered when making departmental decisions, therefore contributing to the satisfaction from achieving organizational objectives. And then in reviewing some of Leichert's theories, his group decision making, a little similar to McGregor's theory, Y happens when all staff are able to provide input, participate in problem solving and goal setting. I felt that this was really present in our team, especially when COVID really came about and it started limiting in-person interactions. One of the things that we do is we conduct interviews for several classifications throughout our division. And we really had to really brainstorm and come up with a way to conduct interviews virtually. Because previously they were only held in person. And again, all members of the team really got together and came up with an alternative to in-person interviews that was accepted by the agency, that pretty much followed any policies that we had in place, and that were that this process was within a software means, so something that was easily accessible to us. And ultimately, this allowed for a more efficient and less work-intensive preparation leading into the interviews overall. And then high performance goals is another area or another theory of Leichert's theories that I feel is present within my department. And this happens when managers communicate their own aspirations and set high goals for themselves, but also provide that coaching and training and encouragement along with the example being set to their employees. Within my team, really due to the workload and fast-paced nature of our assignment, high productivity is an expectation, but our managers do tend to lead by example, and they also take on the workload while providing praise and support to staff within the department. Okay, now reviewing the systems theory. Out of the three theories present, I felt that the open system theory was the one that my agency and department really related to, more specifically the structural contingency theory. Choices about structure are contingent upon identifiable internal and external factors such as technology, strategy, and environmental stability. And within OCSSA and really within my department overall, social political influences are factors, external factors that we have to continuously deal with, as well as any like economic changes in funding, any new laws that are put in place, any budget cuts or increases to budget we have to quickly react to. And then I think now more present than ever are really technological influences and changes, and really feeling that we have really been feeling that pressure to allow and improve ease of accessibility to services, increase the remote work, especially with COVID. That was another thing that really came about, being such a big agency and having so many staff working in such close proximity, really pressured us to adapt to that whole teleworking. And lastly, really by employing strategic planning, which really is at the core of our team, we are able to anticipate the needs of the agency, again, based on these internal factors that are constantly coming our way, while remaining in line with the agency's mission and goals. And lastly, the impact of the organization on the impact of the organization on excellence. I felt that that symbolic management theory really is what, in my eyes, and the goal congruent strategy and transformational leadership theories within the symbolic management theory is what really kind of described or prove the excellence, of an organization. And this really calls for hiring employees that already share the agency's goals and ideals. This will ensure that employees are thus highly dedicated to the team. So again, when we do have openings in our department specifically, we do review all interested volunteers, and we ensure that they have a good track record and that really their performance and really their goals for themselves really do align with the goals for our team and for the agency in general. And so due to the meshing of the personal and agency views and values, this motivates staff to fully commit to their assignment. In addition, this is achieved, the transfer, this is also achieved by consistently having opportunities for employees to provide really their feedback and them being kept informed of anything that's happening within our organization. We constantly have town halls to keep staff apprised of really any changes coming our way or any developments within the agency. And also we really work towards promoting the values and the mission that the agency has. And this is done through means of campaigns and work groups that are established internally. And this really allows employees to draw parallels to really their goals and the goals of the agency, and overall provide a positive impact, for the agency. For transformational leadership, this is required when there's a habitual way of doing, when we have a habitual way of doing things, but it no longer works, or when there's a major change in environment that requires new responses, the transformation of the organization is needed. I really did feel that, in these last couple of years, the agency as a whole has really proven excellence in this field because we have reacted to changes brought about by external factors. There's, again, always room for improvement, but I have been pretty impressed, especially with COVID, and really how quickly we reacted to a lot of the changes that brought about. I felt that was really due to the leadership and their ability to adapt to changes. And then lastly, in my eyes, I feel that excellence has been achieved when quality customer service is delivered to internal and external customers, and organizational goals are achieved while nurturing the development of employees. And that is it. Sorry, I went a little or way over time, but thank you.
Thank you, Lizette. Very, very well done. You covered all the theorists and did it in a very comprehensive way. So thank you. And that's one of the good things about being able to go tonight is you don't just have that.
Have a lot of time.
So, are there any questions or observations for Lizette? Okay. Outstanding work. Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Gets it off to a really good start and sets a very high bar for us all. So next up is Sam.
Thank you. Go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so for my topic, I will be focusing on the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and specifically the executive branch within it, and kind of the different groups that I worked with and divisions within, and kind of go over the job functions here. But to start with the executive summary, so we're going to kind of cover these topics. So an intro, then going into illustrative management and so on, touching on the different theorists. So talking about like Weber, Taylor, kind of going through a lot of the classic ones and working into like McGregor, Follett, systems theory, Duran, and just kind of going through the different elements there. So our first goal will kind of be to do an introduction of the agency. So the CDFA is a relatively old department, and it's a single agency within the government. So it was established in 1919, and currently it's kind of had the same mission ever since it was established, to oversee the agricultural industry within California. Just for a size of scale, it's a $49 billion industry within California currently. And the department itself works in a variety of ways. So it works in plant services, animal health, animal inspection services, things like that, weights and measurements even. So anything that's weighed and sold is also falls under the department's purview, things like that. And specifically with the executive branch, there's a lot of the high-level leadership of the department. So that's the secretary is there, the deputy secretary. So that's finance and administration. That's all the other teams that they work with. There's the legal team as well. So there's specialty functions that it oversees. That's legal department. Farmer equity is a relatively new one. So that's just making sure that the programs that the CDFA does deliver are, reaching a broader audience and kind of hitting the lower underserved communities that they're supposed to intended to help out. Grants department, which is what I work in specifically within the executive branch, is also kind of housed there. And public affairs is another specialty function that you'll see within that branch. And then there's a few mission statements down there around the safe and healthy food supply, international trade, and then recently there's been a lot of programs focused on commitment to environmental stewardship through innovation and science. So a lot of climate smart ag tech, that's how they'll refer to it within the agency. And so kind of getting into some of the more theory-based organizational analysis for the CDFA and the executive branch in particular, I think the process model that stood out most to me was the internal process model. So that is that process-oriented mindset, trying to be disciplined and predictable. So I come from the private sector, and it was definitely kind of a very noticeable difference when I went to the CDFA and noticed that there was a lot of written procedures down. There's a lot of formalized communication. There's a lot of, even with grant programs, there's a lot of very standard language that's included within every request for grant application, things like that. And I've been seeing a lot of aspects of Weber and scientific management specifically when I see these models. And then kind of building on the rational goal model as well, there's a lot of goal setting and planning. So with every budget season that comes up, there's a lot of working with the legislature to do some forward planning, particularly in the recent era where there's been a lot of budget surplus. So there's a lot of the surplus money has been going to the CDFA. And so there's been a lot more planning elements in place then. And then kind of moving down, coordination control is another aspect of illustrative management here. So the two that stood out the most to me are mutual adjustment and direct supervision. So mutual adjustment being that there's a lot of informal consultations that take place within the department. So just trying to understand how departments can work best with each other. So executive branch, and specifically my role as grant coordinator, works with a lot of different program teams from like plant services, animal services, and just making sure that we follow consistent protocols and things like that. And these happen very much at that mutual adjustment stage there. Another coordination control is direct supervision. So there's a hierarchical structure, especially seen with that like secretary, undersecretary, deputy secretary management style within there, all reporting up through the chain. And so a few elements of coordination control there. And then finally, motivational strategies. Financial incentives can't be utilized given the public service nature of it. So goal congruence is really what stands out to me most. Everyone there really wants to work in public sector, and that's a pretty noticeable aspect of the coworkers that I've seen. And so kind of touched on initially there was Weber and Taylor and kind of taking a deeper dive into it with classic organization theory. So the ones that I've noticed most are Weber's ideal bureaucracy and Taylor's scientific management. So starting with Weber, as I mentioned before, very much rule bound, following that hierarchical structure, a lot of written laws and procedures. And in fact, even one of the upper management told me when I started to be cognizant of all of these procedures and things, and don't try to change too much too fast, because there's often reasons that you'll find out later down the road that why a certain protocol exists. So there was a lot of, especially I think because they've been hiring a lot of private sector people recently, they've been trying to, initiate us with that understanding that there is a more rule-bound approach in terms of how the services are delivered. And then I think kind of stepping into Taylor's side of it with the scientific management, two aspects that I really noticed are recruiting the right person for the job. So with the farmer equity branch that just started up, there was a big push, I think, to hire a person who could actually deliver the best results, because it's only like a 2-person team on the department who's having to oversee a lot of job functions and kind of make sure that everyone coordinates well to implement these strategies with their programs. So they made sure that there was a lot of recruitment effort focused on finding the right person who could help enable that. And then job descriptions were built out to help enable that second person to be hired on, and just making sure that this was something that could be repeatable in the future, and also just making sure that there was kind of clear expectations on what they were looking to deliver. And then division of work between workers and management. So that is just making sure that management is giving what workers, the frontline staff, need to be successful. So with grant programs, that's, making sure there's resources to support administering large programs, especially with increased funding over the past years. So they're just trying to make sure that they're doing the work on their side to enable the frontline staff to be successful. Kind of diving into human relations theory next. So working the way kind of through the years, so starting with Follett, I've noticed the power with approach is pretty common here, and the dynamic nature of coordination. And I think my role highlights that too, because it's a new position for the CDFA as a grant coordination manager. And that is just showing that they've realized that there's a lot of teams competing, not competing, but there are a lot of teams using similar resources, working with similar strategies, and they needed someone to help make sure these were all being approached in like a standardized effort, and that teams were able to build off learnings from each other and kind of work to be mutually successful. So I think that was a noticeable element from Follett's theories. And then from Mayo, I think participative decision-making was something that I noticed is something that is kind of present throughout. And that is upper management, especially the executive branch, is taking time to work with program teams. So not just issuing directives down, but making sure that they get input from frontline staff who know the programs or consulting with them. And then also even between departments, if there's best practices that were learned from one grant program, things like that, it can be incorporated into another. And so just trying to make sure that there's a cohesive strategy and that there is participation in the decision-making is pretty key. And then finally, McGregor, I think CDFA is lucky, at least from what I've observed, I'm still relatively new, to be a Theory Y organization. So I'm kind of mentioning with the program teams being consulted, they also have a high level of autonomy with the grants that they oversee. And so that just kind of shows me that they have these directives on terms of what the legislature said, but then in terms of how it's actually implemented, they have a lot of autonomy within the organization to make sure that it's serving the people that they intend it to. And then, like I said, we're trying to do it in a standardized way, but ultimately they know their grant program the best and who it's intended to serve. And so there's been a lot of push towards making sure they have the ability to make those decisions and structure the grant in that way. And then education training opportunities. So I've noticed when the executive branch is trying to put out a lot of voluntary training opportunities, like budgeting, legislative affairs, things like that. I've seen as classes that you can take within the organization just to get a better understanding of how that works. There's also training opportunities. I've noticed project management courses pop up, things like that. So there's been a focused effort on giving employees opportunities that are kind of outside maybe your normal job function, which has been helpful to see. And then going into systems theory. So I actually think there's probably roots in a natural system with the CDFA when it was first established. I think that cooperative mindset was a big reason why it was initially established back then. And then even the need for the CDFA goes along the lines of maintenance needs. So that ongoing resource need that the department needed. And that's why it became a government agency in the first place and started getting consistent funding and things like that. So I think there was the roots of the natural system, but I really think, especially in its current state, it's an open system. So I think Katz and Kahn had some good theories that kind of stuck with how I view the CDFA, and that is information input and negative feedback to inform programs. So executive branch is trying to do concerted efforts to do like postmortems and understand, after programs are launched, what are key learnings for the next year when this program is being implemented that can make it more successful, and just being able to understand the industry around it, because it's not happening in like a bubble. It's working with a lot of industrial stakeholders across California. It's working with the legislature. It's working with all sorts of different departments, Air Resources Board, things like that. So it's just making sure that you're aware of your stakeholders and kind of the different input loops that can come around for that. And then importation of energy is another one. So just being able to understand all that feedback that you're getting and being able to put a cohesive strategy out there to, enact on it, and just being able to understand the CDFA operates within a system of multiple stakeholders and things like that. And finally, we'll go on to excellence. So I think the book actually put it pretty well when it said you have to develop an agency-specific theory of excellence. There is no kind of one-size-fits-all way to achieve excellence. I think it's a blend of a lot of strategies. We've talked about quite a few just within this presentation itself. And so it's definitely a multifaceted approach. think ones that stood out to me is definitely Weber's bureaucracy is a big component of how the organization structured itself. Open systems is something I think that is really enabling it to respond to like changing climate, things like that, and be able to understand, you know, what are the new challenges that the department faces and how can it deal with them. And then, so these are the ways that they can achieve it, but how do they actually measure excellence? So I think what I've noticed specifically in my role and like what the executive oversees is grant programs are highly visible. And with that comes a lot of making sure that they're actually successful. And so Giron's trilogy stood out to me, and specifically the quality control aspect of it. So focusing down on kind of one specific program is the Healthy Soils program. And that is, it's, you know, 900 farmers can get grants or so each year with this. And to make sure it's successful, there is a robust system for data collection that goes along with it. So there's a lot of intended goals for the program, but they actually need to make sure that they're monitoring and evaluating how these goals are being accomplished. And that's done through data collection and just being able to ensure that, you know, are these stated metrics lining up with what the program intended to achieve and things like that to measure excellence. So I think that is probably all that I have actually. Yep. So that is the end of my presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Very well done. Again, a great incorporation of the theories and very applicable, and they're all applied very well. That's perfect. Questions, comments for Sam in his presentation? A lot of applause. So it's always a good thing. All right, great. Well, thank you, Sam. I don't have anything else to add. I think you covered all the theories very well. So Lizette and Sam, thank you very much for being our guinea pigs and kind of setting a very high standard for all of us. Next week, we will work on some more presentations. Clearly, we're not going to get through all of them next week, but if you want to be one of the first people to present next week, send me an email and let me know, and I'll be able to accommodate you and get you earlier on the agenda for next week. Otherwise, we'll just kind of do a first come, first serve type of basis and see how many we get through next Monday, and everything we don't get through next Monday, we'll then hold off and do those on Saturday the 21st. Okay, sound good? All right. Well, again, thank you, Lizette and Sam. I appreciate you being willing to do yours tonight, and look forward to hearing some more presentations next week. I'll get this recording up our beach board site by tomorrow morning. You've got your last beach board essay, number 5, that is due by Sunday. So I look forward to that. I'll get that graded, and we'll be back at it one more Monday session next Monday and do some more presentations. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Have a great week. And I'll talk to you next Monday.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.